Why are you even here? People like you don't belong in spaces like this, the officer spat, his voice laced with contempt. The girl, sitting silently in her wheelchair outside the school gates, froze as his words hit her like a blow. Around them, students and parents pretended not to notice, hurrying away as though her humiliation was contagious. "I'm waiting for my dad," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Your dad?" The officer sneered. "What? He can't come pick you up like normal folks? Or are you just loitering?" The girl's knuckles tightened around the armrest of her wheelchair. The air was thick with unspoken words, with anger she was too tired to express. She wanted to disappear, but she stayed. She had to wait for him. Her dad always showed up, no matter what. The officer's posture shifted, his disdain turning sharper. "You people think you can do whatever you want. This is why everything's going downhill. No respect for rules, no decency." And then he did the unthinkable. He kicked the front wheel of her chair, hard enough to jolt her forward. The wheelchair wobbled, almost tipping over, but she held herself steady. Gasps erupted from a few witnesses, but no one intervened. Fear silenced them. A tear slid down her cheek, but her expression didn't break. She refused to let him see her cry. "You can't do that," she said, her voice trembling now, more from anger than fear. "You can't treat me like this." The officer leaned down, his face inches from hers. "I can do whatever I want. And no one's going to stop me." But someone would stop him. Someone who was closer than he could have imagined. Just as the officer straightened, self-satisfaction written all over his face, a car pulled up. Sleek, unassuming, but with an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. The man who stepped out moved quickly, purposefully, his presence commanding attention without a word. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He simply walked toward his daughter. She looked up, her face both relieved and defiant. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking slightly. He kicked my chair." The officer's smirk faltered as the man turned to him, his gaze cold, assessing. He pulled out his badge. It was a moment that should have been small, but the weight of it shifted the air around them. FBI. The letters gleamed, and suddenly the officer wasn't so confident. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" the man asked, his voice calm but dangerous. The officer opened his mouth, then closed it. The badge in front of him wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a mirror reflecting his own abuse of power. But this wasn't just about a badge. It was about the man holding it, a father who had witnessed enough injustice to know how to dismantle it. And that was just the beginning. The days that followed would unravel everything the officer thought he knew about control, authority, and the consequences of prejudice. What should have been a moment of unchallenged superiority spiraled into a reckoning that no one saw coming. The father wasn't just any man with power. He was meticulous, relentless, and utterly determined. And when the truth about the officer's history began to surface, it wasn't just the community watching, it was the entire nation. What happens when the one enforcing the law becomes the one facing it? How far will a father go to protect his child and expose the injustice that so many endure in silence? The story you're about to witness is not just about one moment of cruelty, it's about the chain reaction it sets off. Stay with us to see how a father's love, combined with an unshakable pursuit of justice, leads to a conclusion no one could have predicted. And as for the officer, his downfall will be one for the history books. The question is, how does it all end? Stay tuned. You won't believe where this story takes you. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism and discrimination in all its forms. To our Black audience, know that your experiences, your struggles, and your victories matter deeply. We are committed to telling stories that reflect justice, resilience, and the importance of standing against prejudice. Thank you for being here with us today. We hope this story inspires and resonates with you. If you enjoy it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our community for more impactful narratives. Now, sit back and enjoy a powerful tale. The crisp morning air outside Lincoln High School carried the usual bustle of a weekday, students chatting in clusters, parents hurriedly dropping off their kids, and the occasional laughter echoing through the courtyard. It was a scene of normalcy, routine. But for Leah Carter, sitting in her wheelchair near the entrance, it was a daily reminder of how much her life had changed. At just 16, Leah carried a maturity that few her age possessed. Her spinal cord injury, the result of a car accident 2 years ago, had reshaped her world in ways she was still learning to navigate. But Leah was resilient, refusing to let her disability define her. She was sharp, fiercely independent, and unapologetically outspoken when it came to defending herself and others. Her father, Agent Marcus Carter, was a pillar of strength in her life. A senior agent with the FBI, Marcus had built a reputation as a man who valued justice above all. His towering frame and quiet demeanor often made people underestimate him, until they saw him in action. For Marcus, Leah was his world. Her courage, her determination to rise above challenges, were the reasons he pushed himself relentlessly in his career. That morning, Marcus had promised to pick Leah up early. He'd been working late nights on a high-stakes case but had insisted on carving out time to drive her to an important physical therapy appointment. Leah waited near the entrance, scrolling through her phone and trying to ignore the stares from a few students. She was used to the whispers, the curious glances at her wheelchair. It bothered her, but she had learned to brush it off. Across the courtyard, Officer Derek Shaw, stationed as a school resource officer, surveyed the scene. Shaw, a middle-aged man with a stout build and an air of self-importance, had been a fixture at Lincoln High for years. To some, he was just another overzealous cop, to others, he was a man whose unchecked authority had long gone too far. His demeanor carried a sharp edge, especially toward students of color. Shaw's eyes landed on Leah. Something about her calm, composed presence seemed to irritate him. She wasn't like the other students, who often looked away when he approached. Leah's confidence, even in silence, felt like a challenge. As Leah waited, her mind wandered to the day's plans. She and her father often talked during car rides. He'd share stories about his cases, at least the parts he was allowed to, and Leah would tell him about her dreams of becoming a writer. Their bond was unshakable, built on mutual respect and an unspoken understanding of each other's struggles. Marcus admired Leah's grit, Leah admired her father's unwavering sense of justice. Across the street, Marcus pulled into a coffee shop, glancing at the clock on his dashboard. He had just enough time to grab coffee before picking up Leah. His work phone buzzed incessantly, but he ignored it for a moment of peace. He couldn't wait to see her smile, to hear her witty commentary about her day. Back at the school, Shaw had started walking toward Leah. He noticed a group of students nearby, their phones out, giggling at something on their screens. It irked him, their casualness, their perceived lack of respect. When he reached Leah, his irritation boiled over. "You can't sit here," Shaw barked, his voice cutting through the noise. Leah looked up, startled. "Excuse me? This isn't a place to hang out. Move along." Leah blinked, confused. "I'm waiting for my dad." Shaw crossed his arms, his stance intimidating. "Well, wait somewhere else. You're blocking the entrance." Leah's pulse quickened, but she refused to let him see her falter. "I'm not blocking anything. There's plenty of space for people to walk." Shaw's eyes narrowed. "You're loitering. Move, or I'll make you move." Leah glanced around, noticing the growing attention of students nearby. Some were watching intently, their phones tilted subtly toward her and Shaw. She felt the familiar sting of humiliation rising in her chest but held her ground. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Shaw's patience snapped. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Listen, kid, you don't make the rules here. I do. His boot nudged the front wheel of her chair, a deliberate, calculated move meant to unnerve her. Leah gasped as her chair wobbled slightly. Around them, murmurs rippled through the small crowd. You can't do that, she exclaimed, her voice trembling with anger. That's assault. Shaw leaned in, his voice low and cold. You want to call it assault? Go ahead. See where it gets you. Leah's breath hitched, but her resolve hardened. Tears threatened to spill, but she refused to let them fall. The humiliation was sharp, cutting into her like a blade. She wanted nothing more than for her dad to appear, to remind this man who he was messing with. Marcus was just minutes away, coffee in hand, when his phone buzzed with a text from Leah, "Hurry up, Dad. There's a cop here giving me trouble." He frowned, the word setting off a quiet alarm in his chest. He had always trusted Leah to handle herself, but something about the message made him press the gas pedal harder. The scene unfolded quickly after that. Marcus arrived to find his daughter surrounded by onlookers, her face a mask of anger and hurt. The officer was still looming over her, barking something Marcus couldn't hear over the roar of his own pulse. He stepped out of the car, his badge clipped to his belt, and walked toward them with purpose. Is there a problem here? Marcus's voice was calm, but it carried an authority that silenced the murmurs around them. Shaw turned, his expression shifting as he registered Marcus's presence. But it wasn't until Marcus pulled out his badge that the color drained from Shaw's face. FBI. The letters gleamed under the sunlight, and suddenly the power dynamics shifted. Leah exhaled shakily, relief washing over her as her father placed a protective hand on her shoulder. The tension in the air was electric, the crowd waiting, watching. Marcus's voice was steady as he addressed Shaw, but the steel in his tone was unmistakable. I asked you a question, Marcus said. Is there a problem here? Shaw stammered, the confidence he had moments ago evaporating. Marcus's presence wasn't just intimidating, it was a reckoning waiting to happen. And though no one could have known it yet, this moment was the beginning of something far bigger. Something that would shake the foundations of everything Shaw thought he controlled. Marcus Carter sat at the dining table that evening, his laptop open and phone buzzing with a relentless stream of messages. The events of the morning were etched into his mind, a vivid memory that replayed each time he closed his eyes. Leah sat across from him, her dinner untouched, her gaze fixed on the screen of her phone. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Marcus could feel his daughter's anger simmering just beneath the surface, and it mirrored the quiet storm brewing inside him. He wasn't just angry, he was determined. Dad, everyone's talking about it, Leah finally said, her voice breaking the stillness. She turned her phone around to show him the screen. Several videos of the confrontation had been posted online, already gathering thousands of views and hundreds of comments. Marcus studied her expression, noting the blend of frustration and vulnerability she rarely showed. And what are they saying? He asked, his tone careful. Leah hesitated. Most people are on my side. They're calling him a racist, saying what he did was disgusting. But there are others, she trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. Marcus didn't need her to finish. He could imagine the other comments, the ones questioning why Leah had stood her ground, accusing her of provoking the situation, or worse, defending Shaw's actions. He reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. People will say what they want, Leah, he said. What matters is the truth. And the truth is, what he did was unacceptable. Leah nodded, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. Do you think he'll get away with it? Like, really get away with it? The question lingered between them, heavy and loaded. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through the possibilities. He'd spent years navigating systems of power and bureaucracy, uncovering the truth in cases far more complex than this. But this wasn't just another case, it was personal. He won't, Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "I'll make sure of it." The following day, Marcus walked into the FBI field office, his mind set on one thing. He wasn't just there to handle his regular caseload, he was there to ensure Derek Shaw faced consequences. Marcus's reputation as a meticulous and relentless agent preceded him, and his colleagues greeted him with the usual respect. But Marcus wasn't interested in small talk. He headed straight to his supervisor's office, shutting the door behind him. Marcus, his supervisor, Agent Linda Morales, said with a nod. "You look like a man on a mission. What's going on?" Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He recounted the incident at the school, his tone measured but laced with the underlying anger he was holding back. Linda listened intently, her expression shifting as he detailed Shaw's behavior. "This isn't just about my daughter," Marcus said, his voice firm. "This is about a man who's been given authority and uses it to humiliate and intimidate people. I've seen men like him before, Linda. They don't stop until someone makes them." Linda leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. "And you're asking for what, exactly?" "I want permission to dig into his record," Marcus said without hesitation. "I want to know who he really is and what else he's done." Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. "You know this isn't standard protocol, Marcus. You're walking a fine line between personal and professional here." "I know," Marcus admitted. "But if I don't do something, who will?" "He's stationed at a school, Linda. He's around kids. If he's capable of kicking a girl in a wheelchair, imagine what else he's done that no one's seen." Linda studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fine. But keep it clean. No cutting corners, no overstepping. If you find something, we'll handle it by the book." Marcus left her office with a renewed sense of purpose. By the time he reached his desk, he was already pulling up files, combing through databases, and making calls. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Complaints of excessive force. Allegations of racial bias. Incidents swept under the rug with minimal investigation. Derek Shaw had a history, a damning one, and Marcus was determined to bring it to light. Meanwhile, at Lincoln High, Leah found herself navigating a different kind of fallout. Students who had once ignored her now approached her with words of support, while others kept their distance, wary of getting involved. The attention was overwhelming, but Leah handled it with the same quiet strength she always had. In the hallways, she overheard snippets of conversation about Shaw. Some students shared stories of their own run-ins with him, painting a picture of a man who thrived on intimidation. "Did you hear about what he did to that sophomore last year?" one student whispered. "Made him empty his backpack in front of everyone just because he thought he looked suspicious." Leah absorbed these stories, each one fueling her resolve. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore, she was standing up for everyone who had been silenced by fear. That evening, Marcus returned home with a folder thick with evidence. He spread it out on the dining table, laying each piece of paper and photo with precision. Leah joined him, her eyes scanning the documents. "This is all about him?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Marcus nodded. "Every complaint, every incident that was buried. It's all here." Leah picked up a photo of Shaw, taken during a previous arrest. "So, what happens now?" "We build the case," Marcus said. "We make sure this goes beyond just a slap on the wrist." Leah hesitated before asking, "Do you think it'll actually work? Or will they just protect him, like they always do?" Marcus looked at her, his expression resolute. "I don't just think it'll work, Leah. I know it will. Because I won't stop until it does." As the days passed, tension began to build. Marcus's investigation gained traction, drawing the attention of higher-ups who were both impressed by his thoroughness and wary of the potential fallout. Shaw, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Leah noticed changes at school, too. Shaw seemed more irritable, his behavior toward students even harsher. It was as though he sensed something was amiss but couldn't put his finger on it. One afternoon, Leah found herself face to face with Shaw in the hallway. He stopped her, his gaze cold and calculating. "Think you're pretty clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low. Leah met his gaze, unflinching. "I think you're scared." Shaw's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the bell rang, and students began flooding the hallway. Leah wheeled herself away, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. Back at home, Marcus received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end delivered news that left him gripping the phone tightly, his mind racing. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And what was coming next would leave everyone involved reeling. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every seat was filled, and the air buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't a trial, not yet, but the hearing had drawn significant attention from local and national media. Derek Shaw sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced by a nervous stiffness. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something into his ear, but Shaw barely responded. His eyes were fixed on Marcus Carter, who stood at the witness stand. Leah watched from the front row, her heart pounding. She had insisted on being here, even though her father had initially hesitated. She wanted to see this through, to witness justice for herself. She adjusted her position in her wheelchair, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. "Agent Carter," the prosecutor began, pacing slowly in front of the jury. "Can you confirm for the court how you became involved in this case?" Marcus nodded, his tone measured but firm. "I became involved after an incident at Lincoln High School involving my daughter. Officer Shaw used excessive force against her without provocation." The prosecutor paused, letting the weight of Marcus's words settle over the room. Then she stepped closer to the jury box. "And what did you find during your investigation?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "A pattern of behavior. Complaints of excessive force, racial bias, and misconduct. Officer Shaw has a history of abusing his authority, particularly against people of color. Most of these complaints were dismissed without proper investigation." A murmur rippled through the audience. The judge rapped his gavel lightly. "Order in the court." Shaw shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening as Marcus continued. "The evidence shows that Officer Shaw has consistently acted in ways that violate the very laws he swore to uphold." The prosecutor turned toward Shaw. "And yet, these complaints went unaddressed. Can you explain why?" Marcus's expression hardened. "Because the system protected him. Reports were buried, witnesses were intimidated, and the culture of silence allowed him to continue." During a recess, Leah found herself face to face with Shaw for the first time since the incident. It wasn't planned, they had both ended up near the vending machines in the hallway. Marcus had stepped away to take a call, leaving Leah momentarily alone. "You think this changes anything?" Shaw said, his voice low but sharp. He glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "You and your dad can dig up all the dirt you want, but people like me, we don't go down that easily." Leah didn't flinch. Her voice was steady when she replied, "You're scared. I can see it." Shaw smirked, but there was no confidence behind it. "Scared of what? A bunch of papers? A sob story from a kid in a wheelchair?" "No," Leah said, her gaze unwavering. "Scared of the truth." Shaw opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus appeared, his presence immediately silencing the officer. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but laced with authority. Shaw took a step back, raising his hands defensively. "No problem." "That's what I thought," Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Back in the courtroom, the hearing took a turn when the prosecutor introduced a key witness, a young man named Eric Simmons. Eric was in his early 20s, with a quiet demeanor and a hesitant gait. He took the stand, avoiding Shaw's gaze as he swore to tell the truth. "Mr. Simmons," the prosecutor began, "can you tell us about your experience with Officer Shaw?" Eric swallowed hard before speaking. "It was 2 years ago. I was walking home from work when he stopped me. Said I looked suspicious. He made me empty my pockets, pushed me against the car, said he'd arrest me if I didn't comply." "And did you file a complaint?" the prosecutor asked. Eric nodded. "I did. But nothing happened. They said there wasn't enough evidence." The prosecutor held up a folder. "But you did submit photos of the bruises on your wrists, didn't you?" Eric's voice wavered. "Yes. Do you see the man who did this to you in the courtroom today?" Eric glanced briefly at Shaw before nodding. "That's him." Shaw's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Eric's testimony was a powerful addition to the mounting evidence against Shaw. And he wasn't the only one. One by one, more witnesses came forward, their stories painting a damning picture of a man who had abused his power for years. By the end of the day, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. The prosecutor delivered her closing argument with precision, summarizing the evidence and calling on the jury to hold Shaw accountable. But it was Marcus's final words on the stand that left the deepest impact. "When someone is given authority, they're entrusted with a responsibility to protect and serve," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But when that authority is abused, it's not just an individual who suffers, it's the community. My daughter, Leah, had to endure something no child should ever face. And she's not the only one. This isn't just about one bad officer. It's about ensuring that the systems we rely on for justice don't allow this kind of behavior to continue." As Marcus stepped down, he met Leah's eyes. She gave him a small nod, her expression a mix of pride and determination. They both knew the fight wasn't over, but they had done everything they could to ensure the truth was heard. The jury's decision would come the next day, but the tension in the courtroom lingered as everyone filed out. Leah and Marcus walked to the car in silence, the weight of the day pressing heavily on them. As they drove home, Leah finally spoke. "Do you think they'll find him guilty?" she asked, her voice quiet. Marcus glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But no matter what happens, we've shown the world who he really is. And that's a start." The car fell silent again, but this time it was a silence filled with hope. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed. Word had spread, and now it wasn't just journalists and community members watching, it was activists, legal experts, and even a few representatives from organizations pushing for police reform. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Marcus and Leah. Leah sat next to her father, her hands gripping the wheels of her chair. She had spent the night replaying everything in her head, Shaw's threats, the testimony of the witnesses, the prosecutor's unyielding arguments. She felt the weight of it all, but also a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like justice wasn't just a distant idea, it was within reach. Shaw entered the courtroom with his lawyer, his expression rigid. Gone was the smug confidence he'd worn like armor. In its place was a man who knew he was cornered. He glanced toward Marcus and Leah, but they didn't look away. They wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Leah's heart raced. This was it. Every second felt like an eternity as they waited for the verdict to be read. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper that would decide Shaw's fate. On the charge of abuse of authority, the foreperson began, her voice steady, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a murmur that the judge quickly silenced with a sharp rap of his gavel. Leah felt her breath catch, her grip on her wheelchair tightening. She glanced at her father, whose expression remained calm, but she could see the relief in his eyes. The foreperson continued, listing the jury's findings on each count: misconduct, excessive force, racial bias. Guilty. 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 Shaw's lawyer slumped in his chair, while Shaw himself sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like the air had been sucked out of him. Then, as the reality of the verdict sank in, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Leah couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes. They weren't just tears of relief, they were tears of vindication, of finally being seen and heard. She reached for her father's hand, and he squeezed it tightly, his own emotions carefully controlled but no less powerful. After the verdict was read, the judge allowed each side a moment to speak before the sentencing phase. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court with a calm but firm tone. "This case is about more than one officer," she began. "It's about a system that allowed him to act with impunity for far too long. Today, we've taken a step toward accountability. But this is just the beginning. Let this serve as a reminder that justice isn't automatic, it requires vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." She turned toward Leah and Marcus, offering them a small nod of respect before taking her seat. Then it was Shaw's turn. His lawyer stood first, urging leniency, emphasizing Shaw's years of service, and framing his actions as mistakes made under pressure. It was a weak argument, and the courtroom's collective skepticism was almost palpable. Finally, Shaw rose to speak. He looked out over the audience, his face taut with restrained anger. When he began, his voice was flat, almost rehearsed. "I've served this community for over 20 years, he said. "And in that time, I've made sacrifices, put myself in harm's way, and done my best to protect the people who live here. I admit that I'm not perfect, but I never acted with malice." Leah's jaw tightened. She could feel her father tense beside her. Shaw's words felt hollow, devoid of any real remorse. "I regret that my actions have been misunderstood," Shaw continued, his gaze briefly flickering to Leah. "But I stand by my record. I've always done what I thought was right." The room remained silent as Shaw sat down, his lawyer giving him a reassuring pat on the back. But the moment felt empty, a stark contrast to the prosecutor's earlier remarks. When the judge announced the sentencing date, the hearing was adjourned, and the courtroom began to empty. Marcus and Leah lingered, taking a moment to let everything sink in. "I can't believe it," Leah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It actually happened." Marcus knelt beside her, his hands resting gently on the armrests of her wheelchair. "It's not over yet," he reminded her. "But we've made progress. And that's what matters." As they exited the courthouse, they were met with a crowd of reporters and supporters. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward them. Marcus shielded Leah with his body, guiding her through the throng. They didn't stop to speak, this wasn't a moment for public spectacle. It was a private victory. That evening, back at home, Marcus and Leah sat together in the living room. The TV played softly in the background, news anchors discussing the verdict with fervor. Leah's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from friends and strangers alike. She scrolled through them, feeling a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. "Do you think he meant it?" Leah asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Who?" Marcus replied, looking up from the file he'd been reviewing. "Shaw," Leah said. "Do you think he actually believes he didn't do anything wrong?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think people like him convince themselves they're right because it's easier than facing the truth. Admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he hurt people, and some people just aren't strong enough to do that." Leah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I hope he realizes it one day. Not for him, but for the people he's hurt." Marcus reached over, ruffling her hair affectionately. "You're a better person than most, Leah. Don't ever forget that." She smiled faintly, leaning into her father's side. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace, a peace hard-earned but worth every battle. The aftermath of the verdict left ripples far beyond the courtroom. In the days following Derek Shaw's conviction, the community seemed to breathe differently. For some, it was a moment of vindication, proof that justice was possible even against those who wore badges. For others, it stirred resentment, fueling debates about the fairness of the system and whether Shaw was being made an example of something larger than himself. Leah felt the weight of it everywhere she went. At school, she was no longer just another student, she was the girl whose case had brought down an officer. Some teachers treated her with newfound respect, while others seemed to avoid eye contact altogether, as if her presence reminded them of something uncomfortable. Among her peers, reactions were equally mixed. Many offered words of support, but there were whispers, too, questions about whether she and her father had gone too far. In the cafeteria one afternoon, Leah overheard two classmates talking at a nearby table. They weren't trying to be loud, but their words carried. "I mean, yeah, what he did was wrong, but did he really deserve to lose everything?" one of them said. "He kicked a girl in a wheelchair," the other replied. "What did he think was gonna happen?" Leah didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she focused on her lunch, pushing the food around her plate. The words stuck with her, though, because they mirrored a conflict she had felt herself. Shaw was guilty, there was no question about that. But there was a difference between justice and vengeance, and she wasn't sure where this case fell anymore. At home, Marcus had his own set of challenges to navigate. The media attention surrounding the case hadn't dissipated, and it was starting to bleed into his professional life. Calls came in daily from reporters wanting interviews, from activists looking for a symbol for their cause, and from colleagues who were either congratulatory or cautious. One evening, as Marcus sifted through a pile of emails, Leah wheeled into the living room. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked. Marcus glanced up, surprised. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" "You just look tired," Leah said. "Like it's more than just work." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's a lot, Leah. People want answers, and they want them to fit their narratives. Some are happy about the verdict. Others think we overstepped. And then there are those who think none of this should have happened in the first place. Do you think we overstepped?" Leah's question was quiet but pointed. Marcus hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer but because he wanted to phrase it carefully. "I think we did what needed to be done. Shaw abused his power, and people like that need to be held accountable. But accountability doesn't mean everyone's going to agree with how it happens." Leah nodded, processing his words. "Do you ever think about what happens to him now? Like, what his life looks like after this?" It wasn't a question Marcus had let himself dwell on, but hearing it from Leah made it harder to ignore. "I do," he admitted. "And I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel conflicted. Shaw made his choices, and now he's facing the consequences. But he's still a person, Leah. That doesn't change." Leah frowned. "It's just hard to wrap my head around. He did something so awful, but I don't feel happy about what's happening to him. Shouldn't I feel happy?" Marcus reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Feeling conflicted doesn't make you weak, Leah. It makes you human." Meanwhile, Shaw's world was unraveling. The guilty verdict had triggered an internal investigation within the police department, and what they uncovered was damning. His pattern of misconduct, once hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and complicity, was now laid bare. He was stripped of his badge, his pension frozen pending further review. The media didn't let up, hounding him at his home, following him to the grocery store. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with him. Shaw had always considered himself untouchable, a man who knew how to navigate the system. Now, the same system had turned against him. One night, Shaw sat alone in his dimly lit living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The news played in the background, the anchor recapping his case as if it were a movie plot. He muted the TV, unable to listen anymore. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from an old friend, someone who had served with him on the force years ago. The text was short but cutting, "You brought this on yourself." Shaw stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The words echoed in his mind, mingling with the doubts he had tried to suppress. For years, he had justified his actions as part of the job, as doing what needed to be done. But now, stripped of the authority that had once defined him, he was left with nothing but questions. The tension between justice and its consequences came to a head one afternoon when Marcus received an unexpected visitor. It was Linda Morales, his supervisor, and her expression was unreadable as she stepped into his office. "Got a minute?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Marcus gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Linda didn't sit down. Instead, she crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I just got off a call with the DA. They're considering a plea deal for Shaw." Marcus frowned. "A plea deal? After everything?" Linda nodded. "The DA's office is under pressure. Shaw's lawyer is arguing that the punishment is excessive, that he's already lost his career and his reputation. They're worried about the optics of pushing for a harsh sentence." Marcus leaned back, his expression hardening. "And what do you think?" "I think it's complicated," Linda said. "On one hand, Shaw deserves to face the full consequences of his actions. On the other, a drawn-out legal battle could overshadow the progress we've made. The DA wants to know if you'd support the deal." The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Marcus felt the weight of it pressing down on him. He thought about Leah, about everything they had fought for. But he also thought about the system, about how fragile progress could be. "I need time to think," he said finally. Linda nodded, understanding. "Take the weekend. But don't take too long." That evening, Marcus sat with Leah at the kitchen table. He told her about the plea deal, laying out the details with careful precision. "What do you think?" he asked when he finished. Leah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I think, if he takes the deal, it means he admits what he did was wrong. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's more important that people see him held accountable than that he spends years in prison." Marcus studied her, his heart swelling with pride. She had grown so much, carried so much, and yet she still found room for compassion. "Maybe you're right," he said. "But no matter what happens, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself. For standing up for others." Leah smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "I learned from the best." As they sat together, the weight of the decision loomed over them, but so did a sense of clarity. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Marcus sat in the quiet of his study late into the evening, the room dimly lit by the glow of his desk lamp. In front of him was the plea deal the DA's office had sent over, the words staring back at him like an unanswered question. The weight of the decision gnawed at him, each scenario playing out in his mind. He ran his hand over his face, exhaustion creeping in. It wasn't just about Shaw anymore, it was about the message this would send. To Leah. To the community. To anyone who had ever been silenced by someone in power. There was a knock on the door, and Leah's voice broke the silence. "Dad? Can I come in?" "Of course," Marcus said, sitting back in his chair. Leah wheeled herself into the room, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, stopping by his desk. "I've been thinking about everything, the plea deal, what it means." Marcus gestured to the empty chair next to him. "You've been doing a lot of thinking lately," he said, trying to lighten the mood. Leah smirked faintly but didn't respond to the joke. Instead, she looked at the papers on the desk. "Have you decided?" Marcus sighed, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "Not yet. It's not an easy choice, Leah. If we agree to this deal, it might feel like we're letting him off too easily. But if we fight it, there's a chance the focus shifts away from what really matters." Leah nodded slowly, her fingers tapping the armrest of her wheelchair. Do you think he's sorry? Like, actually sorry? The question hung in the air, heavier than Marcus expected. He considered his answer carefully. I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe he's just sorry he got caught. Leah's gaze dropped to her lap. It's hard to know what to feel, she admitted. I thought getting justice would feel cleaner, you know. Like there'd be a moment where everything made sense. But it's all just so messy. Marcus reached over, resting a hand on her shoulder. Justice isn't always clean, Leah. It's not about making everything perfect, it's about making things better. And sometimes that means making hard choices. Leah looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. Do you think letting him take the deal is the right choice? Marcus hesitated, then nodded slowly. I think it could be. If it means he's held accountable and can't hurt anyone else, maybe that's enough. Leah considered his words, then said quietly, if you think it's the right choice, I trust you. The next morning, Marcus called the DA's office to confirm his support for the plea deal. The decision weighed heavily on him, but Leah's trust gave him clarity. By the afternoon, news of the deal had spread, and the reaction was immediate. Some praised the resolution, calling it a step toward accountability. Others criticized it, saying it didn't go far enough. Marcus tried to tune out the noise, focusing instead on what mattered most, Leah. But even at home, the outside world intruded. A knock at the door that evening revealed a journalist holding a microphone and a camera crew standing on the sidewalk. Agent Carter, the journalist began, her tone sharp but polite. Can we get a statement about the plea deal? No comment, Marcus said firmly, closing the door before she could press further. Leah watched from the living room, her expression unreadable. Does it ever stop? She asked when Marcus returned. Not for a while, he admitted. But it'll quiet down eventually. Leah tilted her head, studying him. Does it bother you? All the opinions, the questions. Marcus shrugged. Sometimes. But I remind myself that it's not about me. It's about what we did, what we stood for. And that's worth a little noise. Leah nodded, her expression softening. I think so too. The following day, Marcus received an unexpected call from Shaw's lawyer. The man's voice was calm but carried an edge of urgency. My client has requested to meet with you, he said. Marcus's brow furrowed. Meet with me? For what? He says he has something to say, the lawyer replied. I don't know what it is, but he's adamant. Will you agree to it? Marcus hesitated, glancing at Leah, who was listening intently. She nodded, a silent encouragement. All right, Marcus said. Set it up. The meeting was arranged for the next afternoon in a neutral office space downtown. Marcus arrived first, his posture tense but composed. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready for anything. When Shaw entered, he looked like a shadow of the man he had been. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a weariness that seemed to weigh him down. He sat across from Marcus, his lawyer at his side, but the man didn't speak. It was Shaw who broke the silence. I know you probably don't want to be here, Shaw began, his voice low. But I needed to say something. To you. To your daughter. Marcus remained silent, letting Shaw continue. I've been doing a lot of thinking since the trial, Shaw said, his gaze fixed on the table. About what I did, about why I did it. And I can't change what happened, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. The words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Marcus studied Shaw, searching for sincerity. Why now? He asked. Shaw hesitated, then said, because losing everything has a way of making you see things differently. I spent years convincing myself I was doing the right thing, that people like me had to be tough to keep order. But I was wrong. Marcus's jaw tightened, his emotions warring within him. He wanted to believe Shaw, but trust didn't come easily. "Do you expect forgiveness?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but firm. Shaw shook his head. "No. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I did to your daughter was wrong. What I did to so many others was wrong." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Marcus stood, his expression unreadable. "It's not me you need to ask for forgiveness," he said. "It's Leah. And it's every other person you hurt." Shaw nodded, his gaze falling to the floor. "I know." As Marcus left the room, he felt a strange sense of closure. Shaw's words didn't erase the harm he had caused, but they were a step, a small one, in the right direction. That evening, Marcus shared the encounter with Leah. She listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked when he finished. "I think he's trying to," Marcus said. "And maybe that's a start." Leah nodded, her gaze distant. "I don't know if I can forgive him," she admitted. "Not yet." "And that's okay," Marcus said. "Forgiveness isn't for him, it's for you. Take your time." Leah looked at her father, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thanks, Dad. For everything." Marcus smiled back, pulling her into a gentle hug. As they sat together, the weight of the past weeks began to lift, replaced by a sense of quiet resolution. They had faced the storm, and while the scars remained, they had also found strength, in each other, and in the fight for what was right. The sentencing hearing was set for a rainy morning, the overcast sky mirroring the somber mood in the courtroom. Leah sat beside Marcus, her expression calm but watchful. They had come a long way, endured so much, and now the final chapter of this ordeal was unfolding. Derek Shaw stood before the judge, his posture stiff, his hands clasped behind his back. He had already agreed to the plea deal, which would include a reduced prison sentence, mandatory counseling, and a permanent prohibition from working in law enforcement. It was a significant fall from the position of authority he had once abused so freely. The judge's voice was steady as he addressed Shaw. "Mr. Shaw, you have betrayed the trust placed in you as a law enforcement officer. Your actions not only harmed individuals but also eroded public confidence in the system meant to protect them. This court hopes that, during your sentence, you reflect on the damage you've caused and take steps to rebuild your character." Shaw nodded solemnly. He didn't speak, but there was something in his expression, a quiet resignation that hinted at a man beginning to understand the weight of his actions. As the judge handed down the sentence, there were no dramatic outbursts, no cries of injustice. The room was silent, as though everyone present understood that this was more than just punishment, it was the start of healing. Leah and Marcus walked out of the courthouse together, the cool rain misting their faces. Leah tilted her head back slightly, letting the drops fall. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of closure. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked as they reached the car. Leah thought for a moment before replying. "Not happy. Not sad. Just, lighter." Marcus smiled softly. "That's enough for now." Back at home, Leah found herself drawn to her notebook, the one she used for her creative writing. She opened it to a fresh page and began to write, the words flowing effortlessly. It wasn't about Shaw, or even the case, it was about resilience, about finding strength in the face of injustice. For Leah, writing was her way of processing everything, of making sense of the chaos. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a new normal. Shaw's sentencing marked the beginning of broader conversations in the community about accountability and reform. Marcus found himself invited to panels and discussions, his expertise and personal experience lending weight to the conversations. While he was proud to contribute, he made it clear that he wasn't the hero of this story. "Leah's the one who stood her ground," he said during a local news interview. "She's the reason we're here today. I just did my job as her father." Leah, for her part, continued to grow into her role as a quiet leader. Her story resonated far beyond their small town, inspiring others to speak out against injustice. She was invited to share her experiences at events, her words leaving audiences moved and inspired. She spoke not about vengeance but about the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it felt impossible. One day, while Marcus was reviewing case files at work, he received a letter from Shaw. It was handwritten, the penmanship neat but uneven, as though the writer had struggled with the words. Marcus hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The letter was short but genuine. Shaw apologized once more, not just for his actions toward Leah but for the harm he had caused to others. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he simply expressed a desire to be better. Marcus read the letter twice before setting it down. He didn't know if he could forgive Shaw, but he recognized the effort it had taken to write those words. When he shared the letter with Leah, her reaction was measured. "Do you believe him?" she asked. "I think he's trying," Marcus replied honestly. "And maybe that's all we can ask for." Leah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive him," she said. "But I think I'm okay with that." As time went on, Marcus and Leah found a new rhythm. Their bond, forged through adversity, grew even stronger. They laughed more, talked about lighter things, and focused on the future. Leah's writing flourished, and Marcus couldn't hide his pride when she shared her stories with him. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Leah turned to her father. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if that day hadn't happened?" she asked. Marcus considered her question carefully. "I do," he admitted. "But then I think about what we've learned, what we've done, and how much stronger we are because of it. And I wouldn't trade that for anything." Leah smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Me neither. This story isn't just about one family's fight for justice. It's about the courage to stand up against what's wrong, even when the odds feel insurmountable. It's about the power of resilience, the importance of accountability, and the possibility of change. What would you have done in Marcus's shoes? Or in Leah's? Have you ever faced a moment when you had to stand up for yourself or someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear your perspective. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength within us all. See you next time.